Excellent. And then, of course, I believe we have a memo sitting in Superintendent Pufal's box, but we certainly have information from the DPI too, relative to our October 1st, 2021 equalized property values. And of course, that's an important factor when we calculate the mill rate. And then the next item that we're waiting for will be released to the district, all Wisconsin school districts, on October 15th, and that is the final general equalization aid. So we've been working with the July 1st estimate until this point in time. So all these final factors come into essentially what you all will receive in the forthcoming weeks in terms of the final budget, as well as a consideration to adopt that budget and certify the levy. So a lot of times we like to cut this as close as possible, but keep in mind, even the data that we'll be releasing to the newspaper as part of the publication for the 6590 is really still somewhat draft, right? It's not cast in stone quite yet because we're waiting and have been waiting for some of these other elements. All along, right, we've been talking a little bit about ESSER 2 and 3. ESSER 1 is essentially done. Some of our private school partners still have ESSER 1 dollars available within their respective budgets. Again, as the school district, we are the fiscal agent for that, right? So it is also a factor of our budget, but they're not necessarily our dollars. So we will capture both the revenue and expenses which offset, but again, those are dollars dedicated to our private school partners. For ESSER 2 and 3, and we won't go through this ad nauseum and in great detail, there is no private school fiscal responsibility on behalf of the district. We are in the midst of ESSER 2. ESSER 2 is a recap of $7.4 million, right? That is essentially dollars available to us from March of 2020. We can go back, but we're not necessarily going to go back. We're looking at a cast forward all the way until September 30th, 2023. So we really have 2 fiscal years in which to consume ESSER 2. It's our intent to really capture as much ESSER 2 and spend that down this fiscal year, but we recognize too, business services and I think administratively will have some carryover into ESSER 3. ESSER 3, the window for that application will open up probably within about the next month, right, is when we can begin to fulfill an application. So we haven't gotten to that point yet in terms of really identifying explicitly some dollars. We're still somewhat in concept, simply because really we're focused on ESSER 2. When you look at the PI 6590, all right, you're going to ask, is all 7.4 million in that budget publication? The answer to that is no. It's really probably about 50% at this point in time, because that's essentially what our WISE grant or DPI application has within its application. So that's a little bit about ESSER 2 and ESSER 3. Any questions on the ESSERs before we move on? Okay, hearing none. All right, so we went through, we saw this slide back in July, and essentially this is the 2021, and actually that's a typo. So it's really our 21-22 budget additions and reductions. So when we dumped everything into our forecast model, we had about a $1.6 million deficit. We worked through some reductions, and we essentially got to a little bit of a surplus. So we've worked through that, and again, the budget process is something that continues to move forward almost all year long, but obviously to a point of formality come October. So what you see in the 6590 is really a balanced budget. So we're going to take you through what that 6590 looks like right now. We're going to focus on Fund 10. Fund 10, as I'm sure everyone is aware who's in this room, but perhaps there are those in the listening audience. Fund 10 is our general operating fund. And so that's everything from local taxes, right, to state aid, to federal aids, and of course, corresponding expenditures, both local as well as grant funded within Fund 10. So if we look at our unaudited figures for this last year, 2021, approximately, and I'm going to round here, we had actual revenues and expenses, revenues of $120,306,000 and expenses of $119,744. So that's just roughly over a $500,000 contribution to the Fund 10 fund balance on a budget of about $120 million. When we cast forward a little bit, so we look at our 21-22 budget, So we're projecting 127 million, which encompasses about 3.5 million of ESSER 2 funds, as well as expenses, and then again a balanced budget at 127 million. So keep in mind, we talked a little bit about this last year, as we see an increase in aid, so that's captured in that. All right, we also see an increase in ESSER 2 funding, that's captured, right? And so we also have to essentially record as both a revenue and expense any leases for technology. And that's been a method for us, is to lease our technology. It helps with our planning and our replacement schedule. And so it's an accounting function, but we capture that as both revenue and expenses. So someone goes, well, my God, you went from 120 to 127 million. You're killing me on the taxes. Keep in mind, 3.5 million of that, right, relates to ESSER 2 funding. Nearly another 2 million relates to leases. Right? And so we're really consuming a lot of that. And also keep in mind, we passed an operating referendum for Fund 10 at 3.5 million. All right. So the mechanics of school finance, and you say, well, Dan, not all of that adds up to 7 million, which we're going to say exactly, and welcome to school finance. Special Education Fund, Fund 27. So there we're somewhat consistent, right around the 20 million mark. All right, and so that's where we were back in 2019-20. That's roughly where we finished again, 20 million, 20.3 million in 2021, and projecting a budget of 20.5 million, so 20.5 million. So rather flat there relative to our special ed revenues and expenses. All right, so keep in mind that we take from Fund 10 because we are aided at just under 30%. So 30% of the cost is state aidable. The remaining balance comes from local taxpayers. Debt service, moving on to funds 38 and 39, and these are combined. So keep in mind, we passed not only an operating referendum, but a $22.5 million physical plant improvement project, right? And so we're factoring in those principal and interest payments, all right, into that, and just keep that in mind. Right, so we also, as part of your budget assumptions, and I kind of skipped over your budget assumptions, but they are at your side table as well. Those were assumptions the board adopted, administration developed back in the winter, and they really serve as guardrails. They're going to change a little bit, right, because we're assuming certain things relative to health insurance costs and dental costs and labor costs and other costs, as well as anticipated revenue. So they serve as a guardrail, as you well know, in the creation of our 21-22 operating budget. Part of that was also the opportunity to take advantage of debt opportunity and the opportunity to prepay should that factor in. So that's certainly a component of our budget development. Capital projects, Fund 46 and 49. So again, we referenced earlier the 22.5 million, right? We have to book that as revenue, right? When we receive it, when we close those bonds. So if someone were to look at this and say, oh my gosh, are you taxing me right away for $26 million? The answer is no, right? We have to record that as a revenue, right? And so we'll continue to record those expenses. We recognize in this fiscal year, right, which includes June 30th, 2022, we'll still have obligations relative to our secure pathway, boiler, life safety systems beyond fiscal year, which is why we're not closing out all 22.5 million come June 30th, 2022. Lots of 22s. Jim Deegan, Liz Liedel, Nadine run a great food service program. We've been hovering about 5.25, 5.5 million in revenue and expenditures, at least in recent years. And so that's essentially what we're projecting again. So keep in mind, relative to food is all meals, right, outside of a la carte, right, are subsidized by the federal government. So essentially abolishing for the time being, I would say, free and reduced eligibility, right? Everyone is eligible for a meal, regardless of income status. And so if you want a slice of pizza and that's a la carte, you pay cash for that. If you want essentially our standard meal program in school, we'll provide you with that meal. We then request reimbursement from the federal government. So the also is keep in mind when we look at our revenues and expenses related to food service. This happened a little bit last year to where maybe actually we did well last year, about $130,000 in profit. But if we have a capital project relative, so when we did the Adams project, that comes out of the food service fund balance. So it doesn't come out of district operating funds. I think it was a question that came up at the last board meeting, right? So Fund 10, Fund 50, right, really is its own fund. Now it's part of the team, it's part of the district, right? There are staff, but from a revenue and expense standpoint, right, everything comes in Fund 50. If Fund 50 were to run a deficit and had no fund balance, all right, then Fund 10 would be on the hook, right? Because Fund 50 cannot operate in a deficit. So it'll balance out at zero if need be. But again, that is not the case. So we've had a very robust food service program for years now. Fund 80 is our community service program, right? And so when it comes to Fund 80, really what it is it's our focus on early literacy. And so you may recall as a board, essentially the continued investment in early literacy, a focal point of the district. And since that is available to any child in any family that resides within the School District of Janesville, whether they attend our schools or not, it is an eligible Fund 80 expense and revenue. So that was the proposal that Superintendent Pufall shared with you last board meeting, and the board supported. And so now we need to factor that into our budget. So a couple next steps as we wind down for questions is September 3rd, Friday count, still finalizing that. And that involves membership, open enrollment, both revenues and expenses. The Janesville International Exchange Program is not part of the third Friday count per se, right? But we do count those students just like we would any other student and factor them in. All right, so they are essentially a reduction for us, right? But then we're capturing them as a revenue and expense as part of the Janesville International Exchange Program. Final equalized property values, again, we just got that data, I believe, on Friday. It was released. We have not factored that in. General equalization aid the same, but as we progress and as you see that budget, if you will, guide that's forthcoming, we'll really start to solidify that. And then the budget publication I just referenced, it's not what I just referenced, but the budget publication will go out this week. We have to run that twice prior to the budget hearing, budget adoption, and levy certification on October 26th. Questions, Commissioner Ardrey?
Questions? One question I have, and it's probably in here, and I guess I just wasn't sure, is with the state budget that was signed, the way it was parsed out, it was an additional $100 million going to schools, one-time federal funds for schools. Was that a part of the ESSER programs, or was that in a different batch of dollars? Do you know the answer?
Yes.
Okay.
So the answer is it was not part, if you will, of the overall state's commitment to K-12 education. I would deem it similar to a community block grant, to where the ability to provide K-12 is outside of the purview of the state capital.
So has there been any information shared from the governor's office of how that's being managed or handled by individual districts?
Yeah, so again, a great question. So of that 100 million, we'll say, essentially there'll be a per capita assignment based upon the third Friday count. And so when we take a look at our district residents, and again, it's either our district residents' account, sometimes it varies, or it will be what just our enrollment is, right? And so either one of those two factors is what then, and that's obviously statewide. So we take the number of students, divide that into $100 million, and that's what we'll receive. So probably about 100, 107, 109, 111 for each of our students, either a member or actually enrolled in the district, or a seat count. And that is not factored yet into the budget that you see before you.
Okay, that's what I assumed. And do you know if that will be a part of g- well, the overall general equalization aid information?
Yeah, perhaps not so much
Okay.
equalization aid information, right? So the DPI report that Kim Perenboom and her staff related to the third Friday count was due this past Friday. So we do know out of her office there'll be an amendment to that, which is again why we're not trying to be coy. It's just the dynamic nature of this time of year. And so once all the districts have submitted that, we expect to hear from the DPI in terms of what that actual allocation will be for the School District of Janesville, as well as every other school district. So in terms of the timing of that notice, as well as the disbursement, that has not been shared, at least with me. I know Superintendent Pufall is on a call, and he was on with the Assistant State Superintendent from the Department of Public Instruction. So perhaps he has a little more insight, but that call was just this last Friday, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and I think you've already captured what was shared in that call. That was really it, that it's going to be based on third Friday count, and no really additional information about exactly when that information will be released. And so we're just kind of waiting to hear from the governor's office.
So I mentioned that because it is, I mean, that's something we really hadn't talked about, because that was just the governor saying, here's what I'm going to do. And the interesting part, there are no strings attached to that money. So you can use it for whatever you want to use it for. So it'll be interesting to see how much that is. And then I guess as that gets figured out. So I didn't know if my fellow commissioners had recognized that that was a part of the state budget. And I just wanted to highlight and make sure that that is another unknown.
Mm-hmm.
That will be money coming in. So
it's so much unknown, we didn't even really factor it in.
Right.
So, it was one of those, right, to where when the governor signed the budget and he made that commitment, right, I think everyone was wondering, so how's that going to work, right? So we obviously have a very intelligent governor, right? But when you get to a school business official as well as superintendent throughout all 422 school districts, we're like, great. And how's that going to work?
Yeah.
So, and then I think, again, as Superintendent Pufall alluded to, we're just really starting to hear about, essentially it's going to be based on third Friday count, which we all kind of assumed, but that's an official word, and then we'll see how the details shake out.
My understanding was that money technically is kind of a pass-through in which it adjusts one fund down and another one up. And in essence, what it's doing is going to lower property taxes. It isn't going to go into the district. It goes in, but passes through to property tax reductions.
So you're really close on that, Commissioner Donnerhausen, right? And you're close in that there's 110 million in the equalization aid, and there's about 110 million that the governor will be passing through. So one, the equalization aid will do exactly as you suggested in terms of lowering property taxes. So the additional funds, 110 million, is essentially then going to be used by districts at their discretion, as Commissioner Ardrey referenced, right?
Right.
So $200 million values there, one for property tax relief, the other, and it's not, again, it's you're correct in terms of it's like a community block grant, right? So the state Senate, state assembly, to my understanding, does not have the ability to disperse those funds. It's the prerogative of the governor, thus his prerogative to essentially pass that through to school districts throughout the state.
So it'll be funds that we actually will have coming that we can put into the school district
You are correct.
for books or whatever?
You are correct.
Okay, because I thought we had to pass it through and give tax cuts, property tax cuts
No.
for it.
Not this piece, and if I may, just the other thing that I think we know at this point is this is one-time money. and so it's not recurring, right? And so it'll have a one-time effect, and we have to hence then kind of be strategic about using it on one-time expenses for the most part, rather than recurring costs, because otherwise that will bite us down the road. So
Absolutely, and if I may, just to piggyback Superintendent Pufal's comments, and I think, this board, this administration, right, really is considerate of not creating a fiscal cliff, right, and so being very judicious in terms of how we're using ESSER 2 and ESSER 3, while we certainly may be paying salaries and benefits, right, to provide additional instruction to cover learning loss, right, and to keep our class size low. All right, those are not FTEs, those are not salaries and benefits that we're looking to see go on in perpetuity that we will need to factor into future budgets. Right, so we understand from a staffing standpoint, should anyone be listening, right, that we have turnover, right? So perhaps that additional third grade teacher at an elementary school we hired, right? That individual doesn't know the accounting code to which they've been assigned, but we recognize the staff turnover, and that eventually, right, we certainly hope to retain what we assume to be a very high caliber teacher that we hired in order to keep class size and to address learning loss, right? So because of that churn, for lack of a more formal word, we know that we're not creating a fiscal cliff for us. So another important word, right, that Superintendent Pufal mentioned was, recurring and non-recurring. Not speaking of referendum dollars, right, but truly understanding what our recurring costs are, things that we need to do annually in order to maintain the educational services we provide, right, on an ongoing basis, versus saying, well, maybe we have some money, right, so what one-time job can we do? Right? And I'm not here to necessarily advocate for one or another, but whether it's a facility improvement, right, or whether it's another element, that is a one-time expenditure to provide us some future budgetary relief, right, is key for us, right? So just wanted to continue to kind of emphasize that philosophy that administratively we have, and I believe that the board has supported over the years.
One more, and really my last question
Yes, sir.
is, so this published budget I see in my online article, or I bought a newspaper, which I don't know if I've seen any of those hardly, but if I'm, as a taxpayer, and I'm sitting and I'm thinking about, okay, the taxes that I pay, which funds are tied to those?
Excellent question.
So if we could just kind of walk down the list, and that would be great to say whether it is state, federal, or commingled, or whatever that is.
Absolutely. So if you want to take a few moments, and we'll go back to the Fund 10 slide that we're projecting, as well as at your desk side, right? And so if we look at that and we go through, right, you'll see a beginning fund balance, and our beginning fund balance is $24,027,000. Right? So you can say, wow, that's a lot of money. So keep in mind, right, that is a snapshot in time. And as we've talked about in the board in the past, and Matt and I had the discussion just earlier today, is come November, right, from a cash liquidity standpoint for Fund 10, right, will probably be about $1 million, $1.5 million, right, which is a really low point for us. And so we've tried to illustrate that, if you will, during my tenure here, in terms of fund balance. June 30th is not fund balance throughout the year, but fund balance, and I'll move off of that. Then we move into, if you will, local sources, right? So if we were to look at that, that's $32,200,000. And that's everything from local property taxes to mobile home fees to gate receipts. Right? So that's local sources. So the $32,219,000, $26.47. So we'll probably in future years get rid of that 47 cents and have a nice even number. But I know that's what Matt did in his last district, right? Got to a nice flat number. So that is not the local tax, right? Large majority of it is, right? But again, mobile home fees, gate receipts, other miscellaneous income. Could be goods for resale. right? So I'm working in shop class, I pay a little money for wood, right? We sold it, okay, as part of the class project, and so we capture that. That's a local receipt. Then we move into interdistrict payments of 4.9 million. All right, that's a projection essentially of open enrolled expenses going out of the district. All right, then we have intermediate sources, which is 0. All right, sometimes that's a pass through. We don't really have any of that. Sometimes we've had it in the past, but you see it's been fairly minimal. Then state sources. So state sources is 75 million, right? So our July 1st aid estimate, I believe, is about $67 million, right? And I think closer to 65. We'll see what that pans out to be on October 15th. So that's everything from state equalization aid, right, to library aid, to transportation aid, right? All types of categorical aids is within state sources, right? So the 75 million is what we as a district receive from the state. If you were doing some silly math and you said, well, there's 32 million from local sources, there's 75 million, that's almost a 2/3, 1/3, almost really 3/4, 1/4, right? But we're not that high. Our funding as a district will still be about 64 cents to 65 cents on the dollar from the state, with local taxpayers picking up the rest. So this is something we'll go into a little more detail at the annual meeting when the board reviews the budget and adopts the levy and certifies the levy. Okay, the next item is federal sources. All right, so that's everything from Carl Perkins, all right, to title, such as Title I, Title II, Title III, Title IV. So Title I, as you know, is really meant to focus on instructional practice and providing resources for students in poverty. Title II, Project 365, really relates to staff development and training. Title III, we get into some language acquisition skills, right? Title IV is very broad, right? And we share our title programming with our private school partners who are eligible, right? So it's not just exclusive to us. We're the fiscal agent again, similar to ESSER 1 and GEAR, right? And then it's also where your ESSER money comes into play. So again, the $3.5 million that we have budgeted so far of ESSER 2 is captured in that $10 million mark. All right, and then we get into kind of other miscellaneous, right? So 800s and 900s. So they're small, so small we kind of combine them, but you go, well, small, it's 3.6 million. All right, so that's really a refund of a prior year expense, right? And an example of a refund of a prior year expense is your workers' compensation dividend. So after you finish the premium year, right, the following year you get a refund, assuming you have really good control of your mod rate. All right, it's usually told what it's going to be, but it's never guaranteed when you sign off on that paperwork. But sometimes you may have a 20, 30% dividend on your premium. A premium, I think off the top of my head, please don't quote me, is probably about $750,000 related to workers' comp. So we probably get $30,000 to $40,000 back as a dividend. Nope, more than that actually. Sorry, yeah. I'm thinking 70,000, right? So yes, more than that. So I think this year, and I'm sorry, I wasn't expected to talk about workers' compensation dividends, but we'll say it's about 20%, right? So that would be about $140,000, $150,000 refund of a prior year expense in terms of that dividend if we're 20% on about a $750,000 expenditure. And then 900s is just miscellaneous. And you say, well, what's a miscellaneous? Could be a contribution. It's really just kind of miscellaneous odds and ends funds. The 800s, which is really most likely that accounting related to leases, is what consumes the majority of the 890 combination. So, Commissioner Ardrey, to answer your question, a component of the 32 million, probably closer to 31 million, is what essentially we're anticipating to be the local tax levy. All right, then when we add our debt service, which is in funds 38 and 39 on top of that, right, we're starting to get to essentially about almost 45, 46 million in terms of a local levy. And again, we're holding off on that a little bit until some of those final numbers relative to membership, as well as equalization aid, general equalization aid, come into true focus.
So just as a follow-up for clarity, if I was looking at Fund 27,
Yep.
then that would be coming from what source?
Right, great question. So if we look at this Fund 27 tab here, you'll see a budget of about 20,529,000. Most likely, 12 million of that will come from local taxpayers, or essentially Fund 10, right? Of both a combination of equalization as well as local taxes. All right, so it's a $12 million transfer. That's roughly what we've been hovering about. We've tried to minimize that with the use of ESSER 2 as well as ESSER 1 funds, right? There's some strategy involved there. Tammy Carlson, who is our fiscal analyst grant manager, works closely with the DPI to position ourselves. And we're positioning ourselves for a term what's called maintenance of effort, right? And so essentially it's the district's obligation to continue special services to our special ed population. And so that's our obligation. There's a way to kind of manage that. And so we believe we're dutifully doing so. And so to kind of wrap this question up relative to Fund 27, so we'll receive 12 million as a transfer, which means we have about $8 million in other funding, most likely related to state aid, as well as IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Education Act aid, on both Project 341, which is term flow through, as well as preschool, which is Project 347.
So as a taxpayer, this would be a commingled fund for funding state, local, fed, a little bit of everything.
You are correct.
Okay. And continuing on down,
Absolutely.
debt service is pretty straightforward, but would that be local, state, federal, or is it?
Excellent question. So debt service is entirely on the local taxpayer. All right, keep in mind though, that is an aidable expense. All right, and so when we look at the aid, so we're not getting aid from the state saying this is for your property taxes, all right, relative to debt. We're just getting general aid, all right, on these expenditures. So otherwise, yes, it's a local taxpayer expense to which we're aided. So when we go out to bond issuance, there's always a factor in terms of the cost of that and where you are on the aid schedule that is really subsidizing that debt service that local taxpayers pay.
Next, capital projects.
Capital projects, Fund 46 and Fund 49. So a little bit about Fund 46. So back in 2015, the board made a very judicious decision to create a Fund 46. So essentially, if there are dollars left over at the end of the year or another funding mechanism that the district can employ, we may make deposits into Fund 46. It had a 5-year moratorium from the first day you put $1 in until any expenditures may be made out of Fund 46. So we've passed that that statutory deadline of 5 years. So we're, if you will, in the clear. Again, the district's been very judicious about depositing any leftover funds into that particular fund. So once again, it's another word I try to incorporate as many times as possible, but fund. So that's a little bit about the Fund 46 component. Most likely, over the course of this next year, I think you will see administration bring forth some strategies or tactics relative to essentially leveraging those dollars for our students and our staff in the current, while still maintaining, if you will, a sinking fund for that unforeseen circumstance. Then when we look at Fund 49, if you will, is just really kind of the clearinghouse for any debt issuance related to a capital improvement. So that's where we do all the very exciting accounting entries in terms of revenues and expenses. It is also, so we do not commingle it with our Fund 10. We actually have a separate checking account at JP Morgan Chase. So when we receive an invoice from a contractor related to the construction, secure pathways, the future boiler projects, life safety systems, we'll cut it out of an exclusive sub-account within our JP Morgan Chase bank that's identified as a Fund 49 account.
All right, Fund 50.
Fund 50. And it is fun because it's food. And so Fund 50, once again, there are no local tax dollars, if you will. And actually, let me correct myself on that, if I may. So if Jim Deegan, who is our very capable director of student nutrition, comes down and has a question, he's a direct report of mine, or he has a question of Matt or Kathy Raymond or anyone in the business services, our time, right, which is essentially Fund 10 time, we do not time out to Fund 50. All right. So are there some dollars, if you will, right? So the lights in food service, right? The water, the utilities, right? Those items we do not segregate out to Fund 50, right? Because it would probably cost us a whole lot of money to sub-meter everything relative to just food service, right? So we do, to some extent, if you will, underwrite the cost of that. All right, but in terms of food product, food equipment, capital improvement, salaries and benefits, none of that is a Fund 10 expense. It's entirely within Fund 50. So again, a self-sustaining fund, no local tax dollars other than the items that I just referenced, such as a little bit of time and a little bit of utilities, is attributable to Fund 10.
So I saw it in the last board meeting, and now this is talking as a taxpayer, and then the board, set aside some money in Fund 80 to continue to promote excellent early literacy. So as a taxpayer, is that additional money I need to give toward that, or is it just soaked up in all of somewhere in here, or where does that money come from?
Excellent question. So Fund 80 is an additional levy to local taxpayers. So it's added right on to your Fund 10 levy, as well as your Fund 38, both of which are within the revenue limit authority. Fund 39, debt service is not, nor is Fund 80. That too is outside the district's revenue limit authority, and therefore an additional tax above and beyond the district's revenue limit authority. 175,000, rough calculation, is really about 2.5 to 3 cents on the mill rate.
And now I'm getting to the question that I really had ultimately here. I thought it was good to walk through it because actually I never heard of Fund 99. I never saw Fund 99. I understand because there's no dollars there, but reading it, package and cooperative program.
Correct. So, we don't really, I'm not even sure we run anything through there, but an example of a co-op program would be if the district were the fiscal agent for the Big 8 athletic conference. Another is if we really wanted to, and sometimes we split hairs because we do have cooperative agreements, right? So ice hockey, right? That's an example of a cooperative agreement, right? I don't think, is it the girls team perhaps, or I get a little lost. I'm not a big hockey fan, right? So, but we may have an interagency cooperative agreement. We do so with CISA, right? So CISA 2, to which you're a representative on their board, Commissioner Dahmerhausen. So that's a cooperative, but we're not running it through Fund 99. It's there. It's just not really often employed. So I think now is an ample time to reintroduce Matthew Sylvester Knudsen, our Director of Finance. It's not as though I don't know, but Matthew not only served here as the fiscal analyst grant manager and then again at Whitewater as the Director of Business Services, but Matt was also an auditor for 2 years at Riley, Penner, and Benton. So Riley, Penner, and Benton would be a competitor of our current auditor, Baker Tilly. So Matt, maybe I'll have you come up to the mic and you can answer President Meyer's question relative to Fund 99 in the co-op.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you everyone for having me back. I'm really excited to be back with the district. Fund 99, my experience with it has been limited as well. In my prior district, we had a consortium grant with another district for which we were the fiscal agent. So we ran it through Fund 99 just to kind of segregate it out so it didn't get intermingled with any of the other funds. So aside from a desire to segregate it out, I really can't think of a benefit to employ it.
So the original ESSER funds that we were the fiscal agent for, the ESSER one, we could have run it through Fund 99. Am I right about that?
I guess I would consider that different because that's a federal mandate that there's
Okay.
the equitable participation with the private schools
Okay.
as opposed to a cooperative agreement.
And is there is it just a matter of clarity to separate it out, or is there some sort of advantage, I don't know, in reporting or tax wise or whatever by separating this out?
I can't think of any advantage.
Okay. Okay. But it's just always there.
Yes.
We just don't use it. Okay.
It's there, so it's part, the Wisconsin Uniform Financial Accounting Record. We affectionately refer to that as the woofer, right? So it's, sorry, yeah, you can stay up. So it's, it's a guide, right? It's also, so real quick. So we have to follow as a district generally accepted accounting principles or GAAP, right? We also have to follow governmental accounting standard boards, right? But sometimes there's a little bit of a gray area. Fund 99 is just frankly obscure. This is my third district, right? We never used Fund 99. So
Okay.
why it's there, it was probably an idea that someone had. You can. There's no tactical, there's no strategic advantage to using it. It's there, and to Matt's point, if you really wanted to segregate. So maybe the Big 8, conference was millions of dollars of expenses and revenues every year, which it is not. And we were the fiscal agent, we'd say, you know what, let's not really confuse, let's run that as a co-op. But yeah, it's rarely used.
Thank you.
Sure.
Can I ask a couple more questions? So I want to go back to the capital funds, capital project fund 46 and 49,
Yep,
just to make sure I'm clear about it.
absolutely.
So I understand 46 is that money we set aside after the 2015 laws that, and that we can use it after it ages for 5 years.
Yep.
And that we keep putting money in it as we go or as we can. And then 49, though, that I kind of missed where that money comes from in your explanation.
Yeah, no, very fair, and a good point to go over. And Matt, still stay up. So when we issued bonds this last year for $22.5 million, all right, so we received that $22.5 million essentially right away from the bondholders. Now we've not started taxing for that, but we receive it, right? And so that's where we worked with WISC. You may recall, bringing in WISC, the Wisconsin Investment Series Cooperative, in terms of proceeds management. So they help us to the best that they can in a really, 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 really flat interest rate market to place that money. And so we have to record the receipt of that $22.5 million, right? And so that's what we record in Fund 49. Then the actual expenses related to the construction of our secure pathways and soon to be boilers and other elements, right, is when that's how we'll run that through is Fund 49. So you don't see that really as a Fund 10 revenue nor a Fund 10 expenditure, similar to what we were just referencing within the co-op, Fund 99, right? We want to segregate that so it's not confusing, not only to us administratively, but the board and the community.
So would it simply be Fund 49 in essence equal referendum payout and expenses?
Pretty much, right? The only caveat to that is, keep in mind Fund 49 as, may be spread out over several fiscal years, right? And so you're not going to see an even $22.5 million revenue and an even $22.5 million expenditures, most likely, at least in our case, within a single fiscal year, right? So you see the recording of that receipt, but you'll see the subsequent expenditures perhaps over the course of the 3-year period.
No, I think you
So the,
expect the work being done and understand the ways it goes through.
yeah, well, it's a team sport and business services. So certainly a shout out to everyone within the department. So it's not just really me alone. The budget publication format, for whatever reason, right, is formatted differently than what you will see as the budget adoption format, right? And so just to recap that, in the budget adoption format, so instructionally, you'll see things broken out by function, right? So to the average layperson, 110,000 function, differentiated, curriculum. What's differentiated curriculum? Sometimes in my mind, I just say, well, that's really kind of elementary curriculum, right? Then you move into 120,000, right? Now you start to differentiate your curriculum between art and music and social studies, right? And so it's, again, I referenced the WUFR earlier, the Wisconsin Uniform Financial Accounting Record, and again, it's a thick book. It's available if anyone really wants to take a few moments because you can't sleep, you didn't have enough caffeine for the day, right? And you want to get knocked out. But you'll see it in that format. That will be a document that you'll be seeing probably in about the next 10 days prior to the actual budget adoption and levy certification. You've all seen that before, but just to kind of remind you of the different format.
I got a few of them sitting on my shelf.
Okay.
I refer back to one another I did over the years.
Okay. Any other questions at this point?
No, I don't, thank you.
Yeah, I thought it was important to go through what the actual publication looked like and some of the information. So if anyone's looking from a taxpayer standpoint, they go, oh, okay, that's what this is. And
Excellent leads.
so it was good, and we look forward to what all the numbers come in as. Okay, any final thoughts on this preliminary budget piece?
No, sir.
Okay, all right. Our next item is future committee meeting items. We have a few that are not listed here, but I don't remember what they are, but any additional items from the committee members that you guys want to have us investigate and throw on our agenda? Yep, Commissioner Domershauser.
It's not so much a thing, I think something we've been working on, but I'd like to go back through on capital improvements and our list where we are on it, what's been funded, what's yet to go on it, so we bring our district all the way up. I know it's there somewhere, and when we get past this little rush, if it's little, then we can look at that again.
Sure, yeah, it's on our list of agenda items to cover. So, but thanks as a reminder. Okay, anything else? President Myers, anything to be assigned to us? Okay, all right. Well, we have reached the end of our agenda. We are adjourned. 6 o'clock.